Medhanandaji is not only a monk of Ramakrishna order, but is more importantly academic scholar. And that's what got me intrigued, and I got introduced to him about 6-7 years back when he lectured at Princeton about Sri Ramakrishna. So that's how my contact began. Just plug in for 2 books that he. Oh, it's not working.
Keep it closer to your mouth, Rajendra.
Hello. Hello. Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, just plug in for 2 books that I have read, and he wrote last few years before this one came out, which is going to talk about. One on Sri Ramakrishna and one on Vivekananda. If you empty your mind of preconceived notion and read it carefully, and I must say, I warn, it requires a lot of concentration and rereading what is written. But it's a brilliant academic work, and I can tell you that the time spent understanding will be worth it. Now, coming to the question of current topic, instead of taking a time on introduction, I just thought about few questions that I would like him to answer, based on his book as well as his. That I know that he had a limited number of words that he had to write, but few questions that I want to pose, and instead of asking at the end, I'll just ask right now. So some of the questions you may have already in your mind. What is the entity that reincarnates or has rebirth? What are the different schools' explanation? And how is it different from transmigration, as it was in Egyptian and other cultures? How is it different? If there is a regression, under what circumstances does human life regress? How is it different from retrograde movement? If there is one, and if there is a concept of retribution and evolution, both, how does it manifest in evolution, and how does it manifest in retribution in real life? And few more questions. There is a concept of northern path and the southern path. One group gets reborn, other one doesn't. So how is it connected to the karma and rebirth cycle, and how do you explain that? And lastly, the concept of Ishwar Koti versus Jiva Koti. Who is to decide, and how does it get decided who is to be reborn and who is not? And what is the process, if there is what is at least the theology behind that? And the last one is this. How is Kaivalya of Sankhya and Yoga school different from Kaivalya of Jainism? And how is it different from moksha, if there was an ultimate merger and no birth? So those are the kind of questions that I have. And one more last thing, that he has also mentioned something about Radhakrishnan and Aurobindo, talking about some nuances of rebirth. So how is it explained in context of the book that he wrote? So those are the questions that, reading the book, I thought about. So I thought I'll just put it right here, and I'll give it back to you to start. Thank you.
Om Sthapakaya cha dharmasya sarvadharmasvarupine avatara varishtaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha Vasam sijinani yatha vihaya Navani grinati naroparani Tatha sharirani vihaya jinam Anyani sanyati navani dehi. Bhagavad Gita 2.22. As a person casts off worn out garments and puts on new ones, a new set of clothes, likewise at the time of death, the soul casts off its worn-out body and puts on a new body. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Nice to see all of you. Thank you for coming. Lovely to be back in Austin. I always leave something to do for next time. So next time I have to go to Barton Springs, apparently, and go for a nice swim. I'm a swimmer. And then I'd like to also visit the UT Austin campus. So that's a good reason to come back again. Thank you so much to Rajendraji for the kind introduction. He's a very careful reader of my work. A lot of people talk about my work without reading it. So better that you actually read it and then talk about it. So he's done that. He's asked a bunch of questions. I don't know how many I can answer, but some of them I actually address in the course of the talk. The other ones, just feel free in the Q&A to raise them, and I'll do my best. Well, so, have we lived before? This is a fundamental question. It's a fascinating question. And one sign of how fascinating and how kind of appealing the doctrine of rebirth is reflected in a Pew survey done a few years ago. Americans from throughout the country were surveyed. And they were asked, do you believe in rebirth? And it's astonishing how many Americans said that they do. 1/3 of Americans. That's a huge number, considering that the Hindu, Buddhist, Jaina, Sikh population, all combined in the US, is extremely small compared to. But 1/3, which means what? Many American Christians, American Jews, American Muslims seem to be also accepting rebirth. Intuitively. Not that it's part of their religion in that sense, but there's something that intuitively resonates with them about these doctrines. It's quite striking. And on the other hand, we've got card-carrying Hindus, people who call themselves Hindus, but who can't quite stomach this doctrine. They're like, it's not. Often many Indians are techies, right? As many in this room are. So, or scientists or something like that. And so some of them, they're like, it's not really compatible with modern science. Doesn't heredity explain all this? Why do we need to posit these metaphysical doctrines, karma and rebirth? So for a number of reasons, I think it's extremely important for us to reflect deeply on these doctrines of karma and rebirth. If you already accept the doctrines, it'll help to strengthen your faith, clarify your understanding of what these doctrines really are. Like one of the fundamental questions, something that Rajendraji was asking. Okay, even if I accept rebirth, who or what exactly is reborn? What is the reincarnating entity? This is a fundamental question. I think there's a lot of haziness about this. And I'll do a quiz later on what you guys think about it, and then we'll talk about that. So there are many questions. And also, you might believe in it, but if somebody, just imagine you're at work and a coworker, some non-Hindu coworker asks you, it sounds like superstition. Why do you believe it? What are the arguments for these doctrines? What are you going to say? Do you know what the main arguments are? So we should think deeply about these things, not just to convince other people, but to strengthen your own faith. It's what in Christian theology is called faith-seeking understanding. You already have faith, but you're trying to deepen and strengthen that faith. So the purpose of my new book, it's a little book, it's conspicuously thin. The reason being that the publisher, Cambridge University Press, gave me a strict word limit. They said it cannot be even one word over 30,000. They were extremely strict. I went over by 20 words or something. They said, no, you can't do that. So I have to bring it just under 30,000 words. That has its virtue, actually, because the idea is that it's an introductory overview of these doctrines of karma and rebirth in Hinduism. And at the same time, they encouraged me to take an argumentative stance. So it's not just going to be a kind of dry introduction, but they encouraged me to take a stance. Okay, so what's my stance? My overarching argument is that it is reasonable for us to accept the doctrines of karma and rebirth. After weighing the arguments for and against these doctrines, on balance, I think it's reasonable for us to accept these doctrines. And I'm pretty sure this has not been argued in as much detail with taking into account the relevant scholarship before this book. So that's one of the main contributions that the book makes. But I also want to, because we're having a book signing after this, to give you a broader sense of what the book is doing. It's divided into 5 chapters. And in the first chapter is called Karma and Rebirth in the Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita. So if you're curious about the earliest scriptural references to karma and rebirth, that's what I discuss in chapter 1. Just to break the suspense, the two of the oldest Upanishads talk about this doctrine, Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad and the Chandogya Upanishad. And I mentioned some of the references. And then I also talk about Bhagavad Gita. I started this talk with a beautiful verse from chapter 2, one that's often recited at Hindu cremations, funerals, right? To remind us when we lose a loved one that they're still there because the soul never dies. This physical body is just like a pair of clothes, a set of clothes that we toss off when it's worn out, and then we put on a new set of clothes. The eternal soul assumes a new body until it attains liberation. Okay. Chapter 2 is called Nuances of Karma and Rebirth in Classical and Modern Hindu Traditions. This is the longest chapter, and in some ways the most detailed and technical to some extent, because one of the things that I'm arguing in this book is that it's a mistake to talk about the Hindu doctrine of karma and rebirth. There isn't one single Hindu doctrine of karma and rebirth. Hinduism is a vast religion, and there are so many traditions within it. And different traditions within Hinduism have differing views on the nuances of these doctrines of karma and rebirth. And that's what I kind of talk about. One of the questions is the one that Rajendra was asking, which is, who or what is it that reincarnates? Okay, and actually, I can ask you, what do you think? Who or what is it that reincarnates? What do you think? Just throw out an answer. Sukshma Sharira is a common answer I get. Very good. The subtle body. There are two terms for the subtle body, Sukshma Sharira and then Linga Sharira. Okay, now what is the subtle body? The subtle body is the mind, basically, and it's a repository of samskaras, the latent mental impressions left by all of our past actions, right? So that's a good answer. Anyone else that wants to make a suggestion? Who or what is it that reincarnates? Okay, so let's stick with this. Here's a question for you. If it's a subtle body, here's a problem. According to Indian philosophical schools, the subtle body is insentient. It's not conscious, right? Even the mind is not conscious. It might sound strange to Western ears, but the mind itself is insentient. It's a subtly physical form of matter. But it is still matter, it's subtle matter, right? So now, does it make much sense to say that something insentient reincarnates? Right? And so now, anyone want to take a stab at then what the reincarnating entity could be? The subtle body is part of the answer. Actually, it depends on which tradition we're thinking of, okay? So the answer you gave is the answer that Sankhya philosophers gave. Sankhya is a very ancient school of Indian philosophy, and they say it's the subtle body that reincarnates. But other philosophers are arguing against that position, saying that it doesn't make much sense. It's like saying that this podium, this lectern reincarnates. How can something insentient reincarnate? You just ask yourself, inspect your own experience. You have first-person consciousness, right? And you feel that you're suffering. That's why you come to this talk today, because that's why you've taken a spiritual practice. That's why you feel like you're in bondage. You want to overcome suffering. That's all first-person experience. Those are all things that a stone can't have, that even the subtle body can't have, right? So the Vedantic answer is that the reincarnating entity is the conscious individual soul, the Jivatma, in association with the subtle body. So subtle body is part of the answer, but it's not the complete answer. Because it's the Jivatma, the individual soul, that has consciousness. That's the thing that has first-person experience. So it's the Jivatma in association with this subtle body, which is the repository of samskaras, which reincarnates from birth to birth. And in chapter 15 of Bhagavad Gita, Bhagavan Krishna uses a beautiful metaphor to explain how this process works. Upon physical death, what happens? The conscious soul, the individual soul, takes along with it the subtle body from this physical body. So they both depart the subtle body together. Just as the wind steals the fragrance from a vase, takes away the fragrance from a vase. Like that, the Jivatma takes the subtle body from the grossly physical body. Okay? So the Vedantic answer, which I think is a very plausible one, is that the reincarnating entity is the conscious Jivatma in association with the subtle body. And as I said, Sankhya says only the subtle body, but I think that has problems. On the other hand, there's another school of Indian philosophy called Nyaya. And Nyaya says it's the Jivatma, the Atma alone that reincarnates. We don't need, and they don't posit a subtle body separately. And then you might ask, well, then where are the samskaras They say that's part of the Atma itself. And so there are these subtle differences in views. I talk about all these things in chapter 2 of the book. Another thing I do in chapter 2 is I point out that there are some quite striking and interesting differences between how classical Hindu thinkers and texts talk about these doctrines and how modern Hindu thinkers talk about these doctrines. Okay? What do I mean by modern Hindu figures? People like Swami Vivekananda, Sri Ramakrishna, Sri Aurobindo, Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, Ramana Maharshi, Nisargadatta Maharaj, Prabhupada from ISKCON, Paramahamsa Yogananda. All of these people, what do they have in common? They lived under British colonial rule in India. And so the whole historical context is completely different from the classical Hindu figures. Why? Because now the British have introduced Indians to the rest of the world. Now, one of the great things that the British introduced were Christian missionaries. so they're out to convert the heathen Hindus to Christianity. And so now, for the first time, not really for the first time, of course, the Muslims also invaded before, but the Hindus now are finding that they have to defend their own religion against non-Hindus to avoid getting converted and just to justify and defend their own faith. Which means what? They have to come up with good arguments to support these doctrines of karma and rebirth for the first time, right? And so they come up with new arguments, and I talk about those arguments in chapters 3 and 4 as well. Oh, so sorry. Okay. And there are a number of other questions that didn't even come up in the classical context about karma and rebirth, but which come up in the modern context. What are some of those questions? For instance, is the doctrine of karma compatible with free will? Okay? And there are different answers to this question. Some of you might not know that Swami Vivekananda gave a very strong answer to this question. He says that the law of karma determines literally everything we do and think. And if you want to follow up, we can talk about this in the Q&A if you're interested. I have a whole essay on this, which should be coming out in a few months. Some of you have heard of Arindam Chakraborty. So he's a famous scholar of Indian philosophy. He's a friend of mine. And because he's basically retiring or in semi-retirement mode, and he's a very well-known scholar who's done important work, some scholars have come out with what's called a Festschrift. That's a German term, which means it's a book-length tribute to his scholarly contributions throughout his life. And they asked me to write a chapter for it. And so so he's one of the first scholars to write about Sri Ramakrishna's and Swami Vivekananda's views on free will. Okay, and so to his credit. And in my chapter in this Festschrift for Arindam Chakraborty, I have critically engaged his writings. And I focus specifically on Swami Vivekananda's views on free will. Okay, so anyway, but that's just giving you, but then there are other Hindu figures, modern Hindu figures, like Prabhupada, for instance, Paramahamsa Yogananda, who claim that the law of karma doesn't mean that everything is determined. We still have some scope for free will, and so on. And there are many other questions. Another question, Rajendraji who asked this, and it's an important question. Is it possible to regress from a human birth to a non-human birth? Is it possible to be born as a human being and then in the next life be born as a pig? Or an insect? Or a plant? Because even plants have souls in most Hindu traditions. They say plants have souls also. And I should thank Rajendraji because he's the one who pointed me to Vedhanandaji's views on this issue. Even within the Ramakrishna tradition, there's some divergence. Because Swami Vivekananda says, when he was asked this question, yes, if you behave like an animal, you might be reborn as an animal. He says it very clearly. Vedhanandaji, for whatever reason, takes the opposite view. He says that it's never possible once you've attained a human birth, it's not possible to regress to a non-human animal birth or to a plant birth. And you asked a very kind of technical question about what's the difference between regression and retrograde rebirth, but it just means the same thing. They're just synonyms. That's just another term for the same thing. Okay, and so there are a lot of things I can't discuss here, but that's the point of getting the book and reading it. And I hope in this talk to cover some of the main arguments in support of karma and rebirth, which is discussed in chapter 3 of the book, and some of the arguments against karma and rebirth, which I discussed in chapter 4, but I'll also show that none of these arguments against karma and rebirth are devastating. They're not knockdown arguments, and they're good responses that Hindus can give to these main arguments. And then in chapter 5, I briefly discuss some of the contemporary implications of these Hindu doctrines of karma and rebirth. They're not just traditional doctrines that we believe on faith, but things that have direct relevance. For instance, now, one of the hot issues is environmental ethics. So how might the doctrines of karma and rebirth affect our approach to the environment, how we should treat the environment? It has obvious implications. Just think about it. If the trees outside actually have souls, that means that the trees have a certain kind of moral standing. And that means that we can't just exploit nature in the way that we've been doing, right? That's just one example. Also, arguments for vegetarianism, and there are other things like that. So I discuss all that in chapter 5. So that's an overall view, and now we can get into the talk. It's more or less based on the book, and I'm just going to cover some of the main points discussed in the book in more detail. So first of all, another major question, very important question, what exactly is the doctrine of karma, this law of karma? And here again, I can guarantee you that people will have differing understandings of what exactly the mechanism of karma is, okay? And I want to suggest that there are two main ways that Hindus have understood the workings of karma. At its core, the doctrine of karma means we reap what we sow. That's for sure. That's definitely true. But how do we reap what we sow? This is the important question. How exactly do we reap what we sow? And I would suggest that there are two different explanations that you find within the main Hindu texts and some of the main Hindu teachers on this issue. There's a metaphysical explanation of how we reap what we sow via the doctrine of karma, and there's a psychological explanation. Let's start with the psychological explanation first. Swami Medhanandaji gives a nice summary of this psychological account. He says, anytime we act, that act creates certain samskaras. It leaves some traces in the unconscious. Okay, so if it's a good act, we produce good samskaras in the unconscious. Then what happens? In the future, those samskaras will, the moment they get triggered, the moment they get activated, we're going to feel naturally, kind of impulsively drawn to engaging in a good action again in the future. And the same is true for bad actions. If I do something bad, it leaves behind a bad samskara, a trace in the mind, which will lead us to, in a more natural way, without even thinking about it, at an unconscious level, we'll have the impulse to do a bad action in the future. Okay? And then as a result, these samskaras produce habits. Good samskaras produce good habits. Bad samskaras produce bad habits. And ultimately, Swamiji says, let me read you directly from his book. He says, the only remedy for bad habits is counter habits. All the bad habits that have left their impressions are to be controlled by good habits. Go on doing good, thinking holy thoughts continuously. That is the only way to suppress base impressions. Never say any man is hopeless, because he only represents a character, a bundle of habits, which can be checked by new and better ones. Character is repeated habits, and repeated habits alone can reform character. It's a beautiful statement. What is character? Nothing but a bundle of habits. So how do we change our character? By changing our habits. There's a lot of research done actually on habits. There are whole books written on how important habits are in our day-to-day life. And so Swamiji said this much earlier. So that's the psychological explanation of how we reap what we sow, okay? But there's a completely different explanation. Now, they're not competing necessarily. They're not mutually exclusive. You can accept both. But we should be aware that there are these two completely different ways of explaining how we reap what we sow. So the second way is what I call the metaphysical explanation. What is this? Well, I do something good. That good action creates punya. Punya, this metaphysical quantity, you can call it, of punya. That doesn't mean you can see it with your eyes, but that's why I say it's metaphysical. It's beyond the five senses, but there's a certain quantum of punya that's produced, it just means merit. Okay, a good action produces merit. That merit leads to favorable circumstances in the future, either later in this life or in a future life. And exactly the opposite is also true. I do something bad, that creates what's called papa. Again, can't see papa with my eyes, but it's a kind of metaphysical quantity, quantum. That papa, demerit, not sin, that's a very Christian term, but demerit. So merit and demerit, okay? So demerit leads to unfavorable circumstances, either later in this life or in a future life, okay? This is the metaphysical explanation of karma, in a nutshell. Many people, when they think about the Hindu doctrine of karma and rebirth, they think about it more in terms of the metaphysical terms, this metaphysical explanation. I would say between these two, this metaphysical one is more mainstream. But you'll also find, especially in a text like Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, you're going to find the psychological explanation. Look at Swamiji also. And some modern Hindu thinkers emphasize the psychological explanation more than the metaphysical one. Why? Because, again, they're trying to convince skeptics and non-Hindus to accept these doctrines. And if you emphasize these metaphysical doctrines, they're going to ask, well, why should I accept these doctrines? Prove that there's such a thing as papa and punya, right? But everybody can accept samskaras. Even modern atheistic neuroscientists will believe in samskaras. Not necessarily in past lives, but they'll believe that every action leaves a trace in the mind, which makes us more prone to engaging in the same kind of action in the future, and so on. So I think some people prefer the psychological explanation because it's more, you can say, rationally palatable to skeptics, for instance, and non-Hindus. Okay. So anyway, the overarching point is keep in mind these two different ways of how we reap what we sow. Both of them seem to be true, and they're not mutually exclusive. They can go hand in hand. Okay, the metaphysical and psychological explanations. Now, another thing that's important in terms of this metaphysical doctrine, right? I do something good, it produces punya, and then it leads to nice, like happiness in the future, favorable circumstances. But where's liberation in all this? We're still trapped in the cycle. Whether we do good or bad actions, we're still trapped. How do we get out of the cycle? Liberation is the highest goal, according to Hinduism. How do we get out of the cycle? So the key here is, it depends on your motivations for acting. You have to purify your motivations. If you're a spiritual aspirant seeking liberation, do good actions, but without any selfish motives. I can do a good action with a selfish motive. I can work in a soup kitchen, but with the desire for name and fame, for the desire to add a line on my CV so I can get in the school I want to get into, and so on and so forth. Right? Selfish motives. But if I go to the soup kitchen, do the same action externally, but internally have absolutely no selfish motive other than to serve the divine in the human beings I see in front of me, then what happens? I purify my mind. That's the result. And, of course, you'll also enjoy those favorable circumstances in the future, but that's not you don't desire those things. That'll come automatically. But the main result of engaging in a good action without selfish motives is you purify your own mind and come closer to the highest goal of life, which is liberation. You're not creating new karma in that way. Okay? So that's very important to keep in mind. Nishkama karma. You should engage in good actions without any selfish motives. That's the only way to escape this cycle of rebirth. Just doing good actions is not good enough. Inspect your motives. Sri Ramakrishna would often emphasize that. He says, look, it's very good that Vidyasagar is doing great things, was doing a lot of social service. He says, but it's very dangerous also because from Lord knows where, ego could creep in. So always be on the lookout for how ego can creep in, even in the midst of your spiritual practices, even in the midst of your so-called social service, your charitable activities. Some people will give a lot of money, but then they're also going to say, I want my name on a plaque saying, this so-and-so has donated $1 million. Again, selfish motive, desire for name and fame. Anonymous donations are better, right? Okay. Now, another very important question about the doctrine of karma. What is the overarching purpose of the law of karma? And one mainstream understanding is that it's a doctrine of reward and punishment. I do something good, God rewards me with a lollipop. I do something bad, I get a slap on the wrist or something much worse. Some terminal cancer and I die. Sorry for being dark. Anyway. Now, this understanding of the Hindu doctrine of karma is so ubiquitous that it pops up in popular culture. I'll just give you one example. I'm in Hollywood. I'm in our Hollywood Center. I've been there for a little over 3 years. And because we're in Hollywood, some actors will sometimes come to our center. So early on when I was teaching Vedanta classes, the Indian character on the Big Bang Theory, his name is Kunal Nair. He would come with his wife to my classes. So I met them. They're very nice. So his character is called Rajesh Kutrapalli. And I'm going to read you a little scene from one of these episodes from the Big Bang Theory, which some of you might have seen. Leonard's got a crush on Penny, and is too much of a coward to tell her that. And so she's dating someone else, and he's jealous. And so he tries to sabotage her date. So Leonard says, I deliberately tried to sabotage Stuart's date with Penny. Rajesh, of course you feel terrible. You completely screwed up your karma, dude. Sheldon, the brilliant physicist Sheldon. You don't really believe in that superstition, do you? Rajesh, it's not superstition. It's practically Newtonian. Remember, there's scientists, right? For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Leonard pretends to be a friend and acts like a two-faced, and then there's an expletive here. I won't tell you what it is. You can guess what it is. Then he says, therefore, he is reborn as a banana slug. It's actually a very elegant system. You know, what goes around comes around. Banana slug. This is interesting. Oh, sorry. And so with regard to this, yeah, again, we can come back to this debate between Vedhanandaji and Swamiji. Vedhanandaji says, yeah, if you act like a banana slug, if you act badly, you might be born as a banana slug in your next life, right? So, two common ideas are built into this karma doctrine. Number one, that karma is basically a doctrine of reward and punishment. Leonard has done something bad, he's going to be punished. He's going to feel bad about it, and something bad's going to happen to him. And also it brings in another kind of common idea about Hinduism, which Christian missionaries will use to criticize Hinduism, to beat us over the head with. What kind of absurd doctrine is it that we can be born as a banana slug? You see what I mean? But this is a popular understanding. Okay. But again, some people might find it plausible. The kind of stuff that somebody like Hitler does. There should be consequences for it, right? So if he's born as a mosquito in the next birth, it might be fitting, you know, who knows? And then he'll work out the bad karma, and then, but the beauty of it is, everybody eventually will attain liberation. And this is part and parcel of a very different way of thinking about the doctrines of karma and rebirth. Instead of thinking of the overarching purpose of karma and rebirth as one of rewarding or punishing us, okay? There's a completely different way of thinking about it, which I believe that our tradition, Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, Sri Aurobindo, and others, what they support, which is an evolutionary understanding, an evolutionary doctrine of karma and rebirth. What do I mean by that? The overarching purpose of karma is to foster our moral and spiritual growth, our moral and spiritual evolution. Does that mean that we don't reap what we sow? Yes, we do. As Sri Ramakrishna would put it, if you eat a chili, won't your tongue burn? Of course it will. But what's the purpose? Is it just to punish us? Therefore my tongue is burning? No. You learn. You learn to avoid doing that in the future. And as a result, what happens? You become a better person. And you make progress, slowly but surely, toward the highest goal of liberation. And because karma, so this evolutionary doctrine of karma, goes hand in hand with rebirth. That's why in Bhagavad Gita, Bhagavan Krishna says, Aneka janma samsiddhas tato yati parangatim. After having attained perfection in the course of many lifetimes, we may make a certain amount of progress in this life. Let's say that I make 20% progress toward the goal of liberation in this life. In my next life, I start where I pick up where I left off in my previous life. So if you think about it in terms of a savings account, maybe I accrued 2,000 spiritual bucks or something. So now in my next life, I start with that bank balance. I don't start from zero. And then I accrue another 3,000. So then in my next life, I start with a 5,000 balance, and so on. And until I get liberation, I'll keep coming back. Which means I get as many chances as I need to attain liberation, which means in the end, nobody's left out. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, everybody will be fed. Some people at 6 in the morning, others at noon, others at 6 p.m., others at midnight. Those are obviously metaphors for a different number of lifetimes. Some people will get in this birth if they try really hard by God's grace. Other people might take 1,000,000 lives. That's okay, but everybody will make it in the end. It's like a long marathon, 26.2 miles. Some people are at the starting line. It'll take them a while. Other people are just at mile 25. They just got 1.2 miles to go. Right? We're all at different places. We're all sitting here. We don't know what's inside and how much spiritual progress we've made. Okay? So keep that in mind. So this evolutionary doctrine of karma, I think, is much more powerful and practical for spiritual aspirants. And as I said, it doesn't deny that we reap what we sow, but the overarching purpose is not punishment or reward. It's spiritual. The idea is that we grow morally and spiritually from it. Now, I want to briefly talk about some of the main arguments for and against karma and rebirth. Okay, some of them might be very intuitive. You might have already thought about them. The first one. This is what's called the argument from verified reports of past life memories. Verified reports of past life memories. This is a hot topic now. Why? Well, Ian Stevenson, a Western researcher, did really pioneering research on this, really rigorous research. For thousands of years, Indians have noticed young kids talking about their past lives. This is very common. But this Western researcher, Ian Stevenson, did really rigorous work on it and tried to verify the claims made by these young children, and was able to verify many of these claims. But he worked primarily in Asian countries, India, Sri Lanka, and so on. And in these countries, because they're Hindu primarily, they believe in these doctrines. So some critics of Ian Stevenson said, I mean, you know, it's not such a big deal to prove that these kids raised in countries where they believe in karma and rebirth, that they're talking about their past lives. Tell me something I don't know, you know? So one of his proteges, Jim Tucker, who's a professor at the University of Virginia in the Department of Perceptual Studies, he's done further research on these really interesting cases of these young kids talking about memories of past lives. But he's focusing on the US. He's looking at American kids. They're not born into these doctrines. They're non-Hindu primarily. They're just regular American kids. And the results are fascinating. And there's a book I recommend if you're interested in more details. It's called Before, Children's Memories of Past Lives. And it's a kind of double book. It's 2 books combined into one. You can get it on Amazon quite cheap. Jim Tucker, Tucker. And I'm just going to give you a taste of that book. One case that he mentions there. There's a kid named James Leininger, who's probably no longer a kid now, but he was at the time. So about 2 years old. And almost every day he has these terrible nightmares. And he shouts in the middle of the night while he's having these nightmares. And he says things like, Mayday, Mayday, plane on fire, plane on fire. And his parents just kind of ignored it for a while until finally it just kept recurring. Finally they asked him when he was awake. They said, what are you talking about? And he said very matter-of-factly, he's like, oh, I was a World War II fighter pilot in my last life. I fought in Japan. My plane got shot down. I was part of the USS, he didn't say USS. He said, my aircraft carrier was called Natoma. Natoma. Gave all these details. I had a friend named Jack Larson, and so on. He gave all these details. His parents are obviously astonished. This is pre-Google days. So his father does some research at a library, goes into World War II texts and all that, and he finds out, lo and behold, there was a guy named Jack who fought in World War II in Japan. Plane was shot down. He belonged to the aircraft carrier USS Natoma Bay. Exactly that word used by that 2-year-old kid who couldn't possibly have learned that information through other means. And so on. So he verified all those facts. And so what does Jim Tucker conclude? He says the best explanation of the facts is that James Leininger was this World War II fighter pilot in his past birth, and so on. And there are many cases. There's another fascinating a set of phenomena, which is called xenoglossia. Have any of you heard of the term xenoglossia? Not one person in this room. Okay, good. I get to teach you a new fancy term. You can impress your friends. Okay, xenoglossia, xenoglossia, like xenophobia, you know, that same. Xenoglossia, because xeno means an outsider, something foreign, something that's not native to you. Xenoglossia, glossia means language. It's spontaneously speaking a language you never learned. It's a very interesting phenomenon. And he talks about a number of cases, especially his mentor, Ian Stevenson. But some really fascinating cases. There's a Marathi woman named Uttar Hadda. And then suddenly she says, and she's an adult, and she suddenly starts speaking in village Bengali and says her name is Sharada. Like our Sharada. And then she doesn't know Marathi. When she's in that mode, she doesn't even know Marathi. And she just talks, she's talking as if she's that Bengali woman in her passport. And so, again, you can conclude from these kinds of cases that she was that Bengali woman in her past birth. So these are really fascinating cases. So this is one line of argument in support of karma and rebirth. And this is a really unique kind of argument because it's if the evidence holds up, this should convince skeptics as well. You don't need to make any metaphysical assumptions. Just look at the evidence and decide for yourself. Give a better explanation than rebirth for how James Leininger could be saying all these things about this World War II fighter pilot that he claims to have been in his past life. Just go ahead. It seems to be the inference to the best explanation. That's the idea. Okay, another argument in favor of karma and rebirth, and there are many. I talk about 6 in the book. I'm only going to talk about 2 here. I talked about one. Another one, it's called the inequality argument. We look around us throughout the world. Some babies are born into the most wonderful, favorable circumstances. Wealthy, doting parents who care about them, and the best education, and perfect health, and so on. Another kid, same age, born into terrible circumstances, and broken family, and they're not educated properly. Mother's a drug addict. I mean, all sorts of terrible things. We know that all these things can happen, right? Why? What could a 2-year-old have possibly done if you don't accept karma and rebirth? What could a 2-year-old have possibly done to deserve these unfortunate circumstances? This is a big problem. So this argument presupposes a God, okay? If you believe in God, which means what? Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all of these Abrahamic religions accept God. And then on the other hand, we have Hinduism, Sikhism, they also believe in God. Now, if we assume a God that loves us and who's omnipotent and omniscient, then what kind of world is more reasonable and makes more sense and does not question the justice and fairness of God? A world in which 2-year-olds are, it seems very arbitrary. Why is it? Why is it that there's so much inequality in this world? How do you explain it without these doctrines of karma and rebirth? Why would a loving God permit that? If you say it's just random. God is omnipotent, remember. Why would he create the world in such a way where poor children have to suffer in that way? If you accept karma and rebirth, then you can say, well, it's something that kid did in a previous birth. Which doesn't mean that you shouldn't have empathy for the child and that you shouldn't help the kid to the best of your ability. But still, it explains it, as opposed to these other religions which don't believe in karma and rebirth. There's no way to explain why it is that there's so much inequality, even among young children, okay? And then another argument, it's called I'll just mention it quickly, it's related to this, it's called the multiple shots argument. In religions like Christianity, they tell you, this is it. You've got this one life, you better get it right. Because if not, sometimes, depending on what Christian tradition you believe in, you might end up in an eternal hell, burning in hellfire for an eternity. It's pretty daunting, right? By contrast, Hinduism says, look, you may not get liberation in this life, but you're going to come back as many times as you need to get it right. And so it obviates the need for an eternal hell. Because eventually everybody will reach the highest goal, just at different places. I mean, for some people it might be in this life, other people 5 lives, another person 1,000 lives, but nobody will be left out. So again, because this doctrine of karma and rebirth gives us multiple shots, it seems to be more rational than a theistic paradigm. A paradigm where there's a God, but where God only gives us one chance, one shot. This life is the be-all, end-all, and if you don't get it right, you're done for. It doesn't seem very rational, right? Okay. Now, a few intuitive arguments against karma and rebirth. One very intuitive one. If it's true that we lived in the past, that we had past lives, why in the world don't most of us remember our past lives? There's some exceptional cases where these little kids are saying things, but in general, most of us in this room have no memories of our past lives. Why? Seems like a reasonable enough objection. How would a Hindu respond to this objection? Well, I want to mention a couple things. First of all, just because we don't remember what we did or said in our past life or what we were, doesn't mean that we don't have past lives. And the analogy that many Hindu thinkers use is, how many of you in this room remember what you were feeling when you were 3 weeks old? Probably no one. If somebody raised their hand, I'd be curious. We can have a conversation afterward. Anyway, when you were 3 weeks old, who remembers that? So now, okay, we don't have memories about what we were doing or saying or being when we were 3 weeks old. Does that mean that we didn't exist? Nonsense. So just because we don't have a memory of something doesn't prove that we didn't exist at that time. Okay, that's the first line of response. But another line of response. Thank goodness we don't have memories of our past lives. Sister Nivedita asked Swami Vivekananda this question. She said, why is it that we don't have memories of our past lives? And then Swamiji quoted Jesus. He said, sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. He says, we've done enough stupid things in this life. So God has wisely withheld from us memories of all the stupid things we did in our past lives. It'll be too much to process. It'll be a tremendous emotional burden, this kind of baggage we'll have to carry with us. We'll be racked with guilt. Who knows? Better that we not know. Let's start afresh in this life and do our best to make spiritual progress. Right? So there are good responses to this argument. And at the same time, now there's this kind of hot new trend, which is called past life regression hypnosis. And some of you might have read this. It's a really nice book. It's called Many Lives, Many Masters. It's a really nice book by Brian Weiss. talking about a particular young female patient. And so it is true that some people may benefit from doing past life regression hypnosis. Of course, as with things like astrology, there are a lot of frauds and only a few genuine people, especially when there's money involved. So you have to be careful and make sure that if you do this, first of all, that you're doing it for the right reasons, that you have a good reason. Curiosity killed the cat, so don't open this can of worms unless you really feel that you need to open the can of worms, that it might help you in some way. If you have some kind of trauma that you're having difficulty getting over, then doing this past life regression hypnosis might help you to identify what you did or what happened in a past life that explains the trauma in this life, for instance. That's just one example. Okay. Another objection. This is what's called the blame the victim objection. So if it's the case that whenever somebody's suffering, that the person deserves the suffering, that's what the doctrine of karma says, we reap what we sow, then isn't it best if I see somebody suffering, I'll say, he deserves it, so just let him be. Right? Why should we help that person? This is a serious objection. So how would healers respond to this objection? Okay. So first of all, let's just take a case. There's somebody here, this person is starving and he's sick. And I'm seeing this person and I believe in karma. And so I say, okay, it's as a result of something he did in his past that's resulting in his current suffering. Now, what should I do as somebody who believes in the doctrine of karma? Number one, it's a huge mistake to say that because he's suffering because of his own karma, that therefore I shouldn't help him. Because that would be playing God. None of us is in a position to play God. The workings of karma are extremely complex. And all of our karma, everyone sitting in this room and everyone in the world, all of our karma is interconnected in incredibly complex ways. So in this case, this poor fellow is suffering. I am watching him suffer, which means what? He has enough good karma such that somebody is in a position to help that person, actually. It's not purely bad karma. Why? If it was very bad karma, he'll be in some island, alone, abandoned, and then he's just gonna have to die. But I'm there, which means what? It's because he did something good, which resulted in me being there. And secondly, if I'm in a position to help that person and I don't, I accrue bad karma. So anytime I'm in a position to help somebody in suffering, it's true that we reap what we sow. It's true that it's something he or she did in the past. And at the same time, it's equally true that if I'm in a position to help, I ought to help that person. Otherwise, I accrue bad karma. So an example that Arvind Sharma uses, he's a very senior professor in Canada. He has a debate with a Christian philosopher named Whitley Kaufman. This was published in an academic journal a few years ago called Philosophy East and West. And Arvind Sharma says, so Whitley Kaufman raises this blame the victim objection. I talk about it in detail in my book. And Arvind Sharma gives a really nice example, which I like. He says, imagine this. There's a lung cancer doctor, a thoracic oncologist, and a patient comes to him, coughing up a lung. They do tests, the doctor finds out, he's got lung cancer, unfortunately. Now, what should the doctor, one of the first questions the doctor will ask in that situation is, do you smoke? Obviously, this is not rocket science. And then the answer is often yes. In this case, it's a resounding yes. He's been a smoker for 70 years, smokes 10 to 20 cigarettes a day. Now, the doctor will probably say, well, it's very likely the result of your lifelong habit of smoking that you now have lung cancer. Okay. Now, is the doctor being cruel for saying that? Is he being unfair? No, he's just stating facts based on scientific evidence and studies. At the same time, after saying that, the doctor would be cruel if he said, so see you later. You got what was coming. No, that's not what a doctor does. They diagnose you, they'll even suggest what the underlying cause might have been, and then they'll proceed to treat you to the best of their ability. And he's going to do his best to alleviate you of those symptoms. That's the way that we should think about this karma doctrine. We're all in the position of that lung cancer doctor, okay? All right, another example, another objection to the doctrines of karma and rebirth. It's what's called the population explosion objection. Just look at the census from the 1960s, what the human population was then and what it is now. Massive increase in the human population. Where are all these souls coming from? According to the doctrines of karma and rebirth, each of these human beings has a jiva, has a soul. Where are they coming from? How do you account for this population growth? Almost exponential population growth, right? Very intuitive objection. I've heard it many, many times. Hindus have two main responses, two lines of response. Number one, this is not the only loka in which souls reside. Loka means realm, the earth. There are so many realms, other realms. There are temporary heavens, there are temporary hells, there are Pitriloka, there are so many places where these souls dwell. So those extra souls can be supplied by the other lokas. And another interesting point, it's not only human beings that have souls, remember. Non-human animals have souls as well, plants have souls. And Swami Vivekananda says something really interesting about this. Swami Vivekananda says, it is a significant fact that as the human population is increasing, the animal population is decreasing. The animal souls are all becoming men. It's very interesting. How he could prove that, I don't know. I don't know if we could do a really scientific study on that. But theoretically, it's certainly possible. Are we doing a census on all the mosquitoes and all the plants? No, of course not. But the point is that everything evens out. Okay? Keep in mind, there are many lokas, and souls inhabit not only human bodies, but also non-human animal bodies and plants. Now, finally, in the few minutes I have remaining, how in the world, this is all fun and philosophy and all that, but how is it relevant to our day-to-day spiritual life? I teach a class, some of you might be following it, called Bhagavad Gita in the Light of Sri Ramakrishna. And I asked my students this question. I mentioned this yesterday, so I'll talk about some new things that I didn't talk about yesterday. I asked this question: how do the doctrines of karma and rebirth, if at all, how do they help you in your day-to-day spiritual life? And I got some wonderful answers. So first of all, if you really believe in these doctrines, some people say they believe it, but they don't really internalize the belief. But if you really believe it, what happens? It means we never die. What an amazing thing to believe. We won't fear death anymore. We won't fear our own death. We're not going to fear the death of our loved ones. If you really believe these doctrines, many people say they believe it, but they don't really believe it. And the moment somebody passes away, they're inconsolable, and if you really believe that they're just passing on to a new state of existence, that they've left the physical body, but they're eternal souls. The soul never died. It was never born, so how can the soul die? Then you won't fear death. What an amazing thing. Another thing, Swami Vivekananda in his lectures will often say, our problem is that we're so closely identified with and attached to our this little I, this little personality, Mr. So-and-so. He'll often say that, Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so. That's called our empirical personality. If you believe in karma and rebirth, you're not going to be so attached to the idiosyncrasies and uniqueness, I'm so great. No, there's nothing all that great. It's just, this is the persona you've adopted in this life to learn certain spiritual lessons. You know? This is a great antidote to narcissism, because in this age, this is a kind of age of narcissism. Because of social media and modern technologies, people have become very self-centered. So these doctrines of karma and rebirth tell us our deeper identity is the soul. We're actually a soul, using the physical body, using our minds as instruments. It's a complete transformation of the way that we think about ourselves. We won't be so attached to the empirical personality anymore. I am Swami Medhanandaji, you are so-and-so. No, who cares so much? We're here, Sri Ramakrishna used to say, this world is a karma bhumi. It's a place to work out our karma and to make spiritual progress. Swami Vivekananda used to say this world is a moral gymnasium in which we have come to grow strong. That should be the attitude. Another thing, when we face challenges, obstacles, difficulties, tragedies, suffering, instead of blaming the world, feeling sorry for ourselves, blaming God, the doctrines of karma and rebirth say, take responsibility for yourself. Another big problem now is that people are scapegoating other people for other problems. No, the doctrine of karma says take responsibility and move forward. And never say that the situation is hopeless. Because as Swamiji says, you can always counter bad habits with good habits. But the first step is taking responsibility for yourself. And the doctrines of karma and rebirth really help us to do that. Another thing, we're all born in this world. We're not born as blank slates. Every single person in this room was born with a different personality profile. And even if you have two identical twins, for instance, as kids, you'll find they might be going completely different directions. One person loves photography, another one is engineering, or so-and-so. How is that possible? Because of what they did in past lives. And so, if you believe in the doctrines of karma and rebirth, it gives you a deeper understanding of yourself, why you lean towards certain things, why you have a certain temperament, why you like certain activities, and why you're drawn towards certain people, why you're drawn towards certain hobbies, and why certain things intuitively they don't appeal to you as much. It's because of what you did in past lives. So it helps you to come to a better understanding of yourself as well. I'll give you one of my students said in his response to this question in my Gita class. He says, karma and rebirth also help to provide a framework for my understanding of myself. I used to feel odd that I seem to be more spiritually minded than many of my peers, and that I'm so attracted to spiritual philosophy. The idea that these interests may be a result of spiritual interest in past lives helps me to embrace these aspects of myself and understand them as a natural continuation, not a single life obsession. I like that last part too. We're all on a long journey of multiple lifetimes, and we can see what we are in this birth as a continuation of what we were and what we've cultivated in past lives, not just a random freak of nature that we happen to be, right? Another important implication of the evolutionary doctrines of karma and rebirth. Remember, the evolutionary doctrine is the overarching purpose of the doctrine of karma is to foster our moral and spiritual growth, which means what? At the end of the day, every single one of us will be liberated. And that's a tremendous source of consolation. We should do our best. Do our best and leave the rest. This is one of these slogans that's common in India. Do your best and leave the rest. We may not realize God in this life, but there's no reason to despair, because we'll come back again and pick up where we left off in our previous life, right? Until we get it, until we attain the highest goal of liberation. So it's a tremendously optimistic doctrine, actually, that there's no eternal hell. Every single one of us will succeed in the end. Okay, thank you. On that note, I'll conclude, and I'd love to hear from you now. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Parnamastu. Okay, we have plenty of time for questions.
Microphone
Yeah,
here.
there's one over there. Just tell me your name first, please.
If you just pass this on to the next person.
Hari Om Swamiji.
Hari Om.
My name is Shoibal. One question that I had was, when we talk in the doctrine of rebirth, when we talk about the principle of rebirth, at the cosmic scale, why do we see the Earth is tiny, minuscule in the cosmic scale? So, like, it seems to be an incredible coincidence to be born in the same country even, perhaps, right, in the cosmic scale. And the second question I had is, without talking about the Advaita ignorance concept, which is beginning with this, how did the jiva begin?
Right. Okay.
And what's the guarantee that after liberation it won't happen again?
Right. Yeah. Okay. But the first question I'm still trying. What is the problem exactly?
So this is a large universe.
Sure.
Earth
Many
is-
planets and many solar systems and galaxies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, the Earth is tiny.
Okay, but what's the
So the
problem?
question is, one jiva, how is it that's born in the same country again, potentially? Like the
Oh.
chances of the probability of that is nearly zero.
Oh, I see. Well, depending, right? I mean, you might think, but there's a God, remember. So this is one thing I didn't mention explicitly, but this is important. In Vedanta, at least, God is the karma paladata. God is the one that distributes our karma to us. Now, if there's a God, and then another concept that's very common in Hindu traditions is that this earth is special because it's karma bhumi. It's the place, it has a kind of balance of good and bad. Suffering, happiness, right? It's not like one of these heavens that we go to exhaust our good karma where everything is positive. And it's not a hell where everything is negative. It's a mix. We need a mix in order to make moral and spiritual progress. And so there's something special about this earth. That's why God will will ensure that we're reborn here. Now you might ask, well, what about if this world eventually, if it becomes inhospitable for human life, what happens? Well, Elon Musk is already investigating Mars, for instance, and it's possible. In principle, there's no reason why souls can't inhabit human bodies or other kinds of beings, like the bodies of other beings on other planets. It's possible. There's also this other planets question: are there sentient beings on other planets? Holy Mother Shana Devi was asked this question, and she seemed to suggest that there aren't. That this is the one place. In principle, I don't see any reason why there can't be. I think we should be agnostic about it. And yeah, and eventually this earth also will, not be hospitable to human life. At that point, We can shift it to another planet, for instance. Okay. Now, the second question was about how did this all begin, right? Somebody's karma. The standard Hindu answer is there is no beginning. It's not just Advaita Vedanta, but basically, as far as I'm aware, every Hindu tradition other than ISKCON, that's an interesting exception, but every Hindu tradition other than ISKCON seems to believe that the jiva's karma is beginningless, anadi, but that it has an end. So there's an asymmetry. You can't say that this is this jiva's first birth. There is no first birth. It's never born, actually. But there's never a beginning to the karmic cycle. Ignorance is beginningless, but it has an end. When you attain liberation, ignorance ends. Okay. Prabhupada's view, the ISKCON view, or at least Prabhupada's view, let me say, because even within ISKCON there's a little bit of difference of opinion on this. But his view seems to be that we were all dwelling in the eternal Vrindavana, what's called Goloka, this eternal realm, blissfully living with Krishna. And out of our own stupidity, curiosity, whatever the reason was, we had some desire to come to earth and experience this earth with its pleasures and whatever. And so then the karmic process begins, the moment that we leave that eternal realm to come to this earth. Okay. But then there are philosophical problems, I think, and I talk about it in my book. Why in the world would anybody leave such a blissful paradise in the first place? It's very hard to explain. And so there's a brilliant scholar who just got his PhD DPhil from Cambridge University named Akshay Gupta, who's in the ISKCON tradition, and he's published some articles on this, defending Prabhupada's view, and suggesting that these souls who choose to leave Goloka to come to this earth are doing so out of curiosity, sheer curiosity. And he's saying that somehow curiosity is something that, yeah, fine, why can't a soul, even in an eternal, perfect heaven, have curiosity? But again, there are counter arguments to that, and one can say, even that curiosity is a kind of vice, it's a moral failing. Why would you have curiosity? If you're so overwhelmed with the bliss of Krishna, loving Krishna and serving Krishna, where's the room for curiosity? And remember, curiosity killed the cat, right? And so yes, okay, I hope that answers. Yeah.
So the last part of the question was, by that token, so does the individual jiva cease to exist after liberation?
Okay.
Because the question then would be, what stops us, if the individuality exists, what stops us from getting curious again? Therefore, no.
Right. Well, okay, so the thing is, here's the thing. Sri Ramakrishna will distinguish two different paradigms of liberation, okay? And he uses a metaphor to explain these two paradigms, either eating sugar or becoming sugar. Eating sugar is the Advaitic ideal of liberation, which means what? The goal is that the individuality ceases to exist altogether. The individual soul, when it attains Nirguna Brahman, when it attains knowledge of non-dual Brahman, merges into its true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. And then there's no question of coming and going and heavens and all that stuff is kind of a lower truth from Shankara's standpoint. Okay? And Sri Ramakrishna says, fine, if you want that, that's your ideal, have it. Become sugar, no problem. Then there's no longer any individuality. But don't impose that view onto everybody. Sri Ramakrishna says, devotees don't want to become sugar, they want to eat sugar. Okay? And then I think what you're doing is kind of framing an Advaitic objection to the theistic ideal, maybe. And so you're saying, well, okay, let's say you bhaktas, let's say you're a liberated bhakta, what happens to you? What does Ramanuja say? What do Christians say? What do they say? They say the liberated soul will reside in an eternal loka, an eternal heaven, lovingly worshiping and communing with and serving their beloved personal God in whatever form they love, whether that's Vishnu. Holy Mother even said once, when somebody asked, Mother, I don't care for nirvana. What will happen to me, the likes of me? He's a householder. She says, don't worry, Sri Ramakrishna has created Ramakrishna Loka for you. And then Advaitins say, yeah, fine, but it's just a kind of like a temporary resting place. Eventually you have to give up your individuality. But look at the gospel. Muhima Chakraborty, one of Sri Ramakrishna's householder disciples, he loved Advaita Vedanta. And so he asked Sri Ramakrishna exactly this question. He says, don't bhaktas also need to attain nirvana at some point? Nirvana means dissolution of individuality. Sri Ramakrishna's answer, do you know what it is? No, absolutely not. He says, no, there's some traditions where there's Nitya Krishna, Nitya Bhakta. Chinmoy Sham, Chinmoy Dham. And he says, imagine an infinite ocean of Satchitananda. In some places, under the cooling influence of the gentle breeze of bhakti, devotion, that ocean forms into ice. Each ice formation is a different form of the personal God. And then he says, with the rising of the sun of knowledge, those ice forms melt. And then the Advaitins will feel vindicated and say, see, that's the highest truth. The forms melt, and there's only this formless, non-dual Brahman. But then he says, in some places the ice doesn't melt at all. It becomes like quartz. And he calls that Nitya Shakar. In Bengali, Sanskrit is Nitya Sakara. Nitya Sakara. That means what? They're eternal forms of God. And bhaktas, they don't want to give up their individuality. Why? If they give up their individuality, they can't enjoy the bliss of God anymore. And so they choose to remain as a liberated jiva to dwell in that eternal heaven with their beloved God. That's it. Thank you. Other questions? Yeah, so there's one over there in the back, and then one up front also.
Thank you, Swamiji. This was very good.
Thank you.
Lecture. My name is Rashmi Prakash. I had a question. Do you need to actually die to break out this circle and attain liberation?
Mm-hmm.
You cannot achieve it in this lifetime because you actually have to go to the next.
Right. Okay, I get the question. So I mean, this is a.
And then I have a second one.
Okay, let's wait one at a time because I always forget the questions when I ask. Okay, just a second. So with regard to that question, this is a perennial question posed within Hindu traditions. Is Jivan Mukti possible? That's just another way of putting your question, right? Is it possible to attain liberation while still in the physical body? And different Hindu traditions give different answers to this question. Okay? Now, and it's complicated. So, I mean, I don't like giving superficial answers, so I'm going to try to give a hint of some of the nuance here. Okay, Ramanuja, for instance, says no. It's not possible to attain liberation while living. You can realize God. You can have spiritual experiences of God. But to get the full liberation, you need to leave the body and then dwell in Vishnu Loka and dwell with Vishnu. So long as you're not in Vishnu Loka, not the highest. Can't be. Okay, that's not full liberation, but you can be realized, you can be free from suffering on this earth, you no longer identify with the body-mind complex, all that stuff. Okay. But in the highest sense of liberation, you get that only after you leave the body. What about Advaita Vedanta? This is an interesting question. Doesn't Advaita Vedanta accept liberation? They certainly claim to. That's one of their big selling points. Ha! See, you Ramanujites don't believe in Jiva Mukti? We believe in it. So that we got a leg up on you on that. Not so fast. Look at an article, if you're really serious and you want to be rigorous about this, look at an article written by Lance Nelson, a scholar. It's called Sharing the Holy Waiting of God, for God. And it's a long article on classical Advaitic views on Jivan Mukti. And what he shows, and he's giving very strong evidence from the main texts in both Shankara's commentaries and post-Shankara classical Advaitins like Madhusudana Saraswati, Chitsuka, and so on. What do they say? How do they explain Jivan Mukti? What they say is, the Jivan Mukta has a trace of ignorance left. Avidya Lesha. It's that trace of ignorance that keeps them in the body and that makes them continue to see this world. Now they see the world as a dream, as an illusion, but they're still stuck. It's like this. Think about this metaphor of a dream, okay? There's 3 states in which you can be in a dream. One is, I'm in the dream, I don't know I'm dreaming. So unlucid dreaming, normal dreaming. Most people, when they dream, they don't know they're in the dream. They're ignorant. Second standpoint would be, I'm in the dream, but I know I'm dreaming. That's lucid dreaming. That's the lucid dreamer is like the Jivan Mukta. They're in the dream. They know they're in the dream, so they're not affected by the things happening in the dream. And at the same time, that's not quite the highest ideal. The highest ideal is what? Waking up from the dream. When does that happen? The dream only really breaks when you leave the physical body. And then there's not even a perception of any dream world or anything. There's just non-dual Brahman. So even though Advaitins officially accept Jivan Mukti, they can't fully accept it. And they have to say that, well, it's not quite liberation. It stops just short. There's a little bit of ignorance explaining why that Jivan Mukta remains in the body. And classical Advaitins themselves say that there are different stages of Brahma Jnana, knowledge of Brahman. And they'll say that so long as you come back from the state of Samadhi, it's not the highest. The ideal is to leave the physical body in the state of Samadhi. Thank you.
Okay, the second question was, in Hinduism, we do Shraddha for the ancestors.
Departed souls, yeah.
Why do we do that if everybody's already reborn? They no longer like little, they're new, they're already reborn, so why would you do a Shraddha?
Right, but remember, the reason, what's the purpose of the Shraddha ceremony, for instance? When a loved one passes away, Hindus, the ones who remain here on earth, they do a certain ritualistic ceremony. What's the idea? Because you're praying for the welfare of the departed soul. That's the idea. Because they're still on their spiritual journey. And through your intense prayers and through these rituals, what happens is that soul will get a more favorable birth, for instance. They'll have a better time wherever they are, especially if they did really bad. I mean, in any case, you're basically praying for the welfare of that soul. That's the basic idea behind Shraddha. Okay? Yeah. Other questions? There's somebody up here. I believe, didn't you have a question or no? Oh, no. Okay, I thought you did. She has a question.
Going back to the argument about the Jivan Mukti, so that the avatars like Thakur and Swamiji, when they were here, they were Jivan Muktis? Because they reached Samadhi, Muktas, and then came back every time to like preach.
Right, okay. So that's a good question. The thing is, Sri Ramakrishna used to distinguish, this is actually related to one of Rajendra's questions, which is, Sri Ramakrishna distinguished two categories of soul. One is Jiva Koti, the other is Ishvara Koti, okay? Jiva Kotis are souls that come to this earth because of their own karma, their past life karma. They have to come back, they're forced to come back. Ishvara Kotis, he defines as avatars, incarnations of God, and those who are born as parts of an incarnation, those who come with an incarnation to this world. He says they don't come to this earth because of their own karma. They come to serve others and help others out of their ignorance. Okay. So with that in mind, Sri Ramakrishna was an obviously we consider him an incarnation. Swamiji was an Ishvara Koti as well. Okay. And so they don't, you can call them Jivan, you would call them, Sri Ramakrishna has a category called Nitya Mukta, Nitya Siddha Nitya Mukta, which means ever free. An ordinary Jivan Mukta, even that sounds like a contradiction in terms, an ordinary, but the point is, that's what Sri Ramakrishna does, is he'll actually distinguish. The ordinary Jivan Mukta is somebody who was bound because of his karma. Through spiritual practice and God's grace, you attain mukti while still in the body. That's a Jivan Mukta. But they came in the human frame as already liberated. Okay, so you can call that Jivan Mukta, but he prefers to say they're Nitya Siddha, Nitya Mukta, which means eternally liberated. God is never bound, right? So when God comes in human form, they don't come as Jivan Mukta so much as Nitya Mukta. They're eternally free. Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you.
So, can you hear me? Yeah. So this is really intense, and I'm enjoying this. Question I have is, how do you know all this is true? In other words, no one's gone that we know of, post this body, and then come back. And
keep the mic near your mouth.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it's flying all over the place.
Oh, sorry. So no, no human being has been able to come back from death consciously. Having said that, I've been there, and this is how it works, right?
Yeah.
All of this, I see this as very intense philosophical speculation. Maybe some of these really enlightened people have experienced that, but for the vast majority of us, when I look at the world today, right, I don't see the effect of millions of years of spiritual evolution being visible with what's going on in the world today, from an environmental perspective, political perspective, social perspective, etc., etc., etc. So is this individual path confined to where I as a person am going to attain my own moksha? Or is there something bigger where, as we're evolving in the spiritual journey, as you said, you come back and you add to your bank, credit, there's an attempt to make the world a better place? Because I don't see that.
Okay, I think there are multiple questions here. So let me try to kind of untangle some of the things that you raised here. One is, we look around us, we see a lot of evil, bad stuff. Now, I think one question you're hinting at is that really compatible with these doctrines of karma and rebirth? I think perfect yes is the answer. And I think the reason is, it's a mistake to think that we're all evolving at the same rate. We're all evolving together. No, people, each one of us in this room are at different levels of spiritual progress and evolution, right? So there's some people who are extremely benighted, who are killing people, causing all sorts of suffering to other people. That's perfectly compatible with karma and rebirth, because it just means that they're going to take more lifetimes to get to, a level where they're not going to harm other human beings. But it's just a fact that most people are not very spiritually evolved. Gita says, Manushanam sahasreshu kasyad yati siddhaye. Among hundreds of thousands of people, only a few even strive for liberation. Is that a surprise? No, it's just an empirical fact. Okay, so that's one question. Another question you had is about, well, it sounds like these beliefs in karma and rebirth are just that, they're beliefs, they're speculative. What evidence do we have in favor of it? That's why you need to buy the book and then read chapters 3 and 4 of the book, because I only gave you a little taste, but there are 6 good arguments, I think, in favor of the doctrines of karma and rebirth. And one thing you said is, well, some saints might have, yeah, but that's an argument. That's one of the arguments I talk about. See, people like Sri Ramakrishna. I'll give you an example. So Sri Ramakrishna, he had a vision when Mothur Babu left his body. Mothur Babu, his wealthy patron. He said, Mothur Babu will not get liberation yet because he still has some, he wants to enjoy a little bit more. But he'll be born in very favorable circumstances. I think he said something like he'll be born as a king or something like that. Some kind of prediction like that. Which means what? He had spiritual insight into another person's future birth. Okay. He frequently had insight into his disciples' past births. He would say things like, you were a disciple of Jesus, you were a disciple of Chaitanya, you were so-and-so in your past birth. Swami Vivekananda, when a disciple came to him to get initiated by him, he touched him. The moment he touched him, he figured out what his Ishtadevata was based on what he did in his past life, and then gave him that mantra based on his Ishtadevata. So these great souls can have a direct perception through mystical experience, through spiritual experience, of other people's past lives, their own past lives. One time Swamiji was asked, do you know about your own past life? He says, yes. And then they said, well, tell us about it. He said, no, I won't. Okay, now how does that affect us? We're not mystics, we're not great saints, so how does that? The testimony of mystics is relevant to us, right? Just think about it. So much of our knowledge comes from testimony, perceptual testimony. Newspapers, TV, what are they reporting? Are we in Russia to know what's happening in Russia or the Ukraine or Gaza? No. There's testimony telling us about what's happening, and we believe it. As long as we think the source, the testifier is credible. Now, why should we make an exception for these mystics? If the mystic is credible, if we have good reason to think that they're genuine, that they're not hallucinating, that they're not on drugs, we should take it seriously. Does it mean that we have 100% proof? No. But it makes it reasonable for us to accept the testimony of mystics who claim to have knowledge of their own past lives, who claim to have knowledge of other people's past lives and future lives, and also these mystics sometimes will have visions, mystical visions of other lokas in which souls reside. So that indirectly supports these doctrines of karma and rebirth as well. They have visions of these temporary heavens and eternal heavens. Sri Ramakrishna did, these different lokas. Okay, so all of this kind of supports the doctrines of karma and rebirth. If you want more evidence, as I said, please look at chapters 3 and 4 of the book, because I'm trying to make a case that there are good rational arguments in favor of accepting these doctrines of karma and rebirth. Thank you.
So we have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Okay. Yeah.
I have a very quick comment on the just first part of the previous question, and I would like to get your feedback on it, because when we consider all these things going on in this world and our spiritual journey, and then we say, okay, it's a really still bad place because of all these evils and all these things going on. That probably fits quite well with the theory of avatar. Whenever there is an adharma, then the avatar comes in. So even our spiritual journey and all the bad things going on in this world are still compatible with this theory of karma as well as the what you call avatar.
Yeah. No, sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't see a tension between all the evil and suffering we see in the world and the doctrines of karma. In fact, the doctrines of karma can explain all the evil and suffering, actually. Each person will have to take responsibility for themselves, yeah.
Swamiji.
No.
Swamiji, what would you talk about then? Give us a little thing on free will versus karma. Where is that? I know I've heard your lecture.
It's a big can of worms. Okay, let's make this the last question. All right, because this is a big discussion, so I've given whole talks on this. Do we have free will? Okay, there's a wide range of responses, even within Hinduism, to this question of do we have free will and what's the relationship between the law of karma and free will. Okay, so I have a section in chapter 2 especially where I talk about this. You can look at that. So somebody comes to Ramana Maharshi and says, the way you're talking, it's as if we have no free will at all. And he smiles. And they say, well, okay, now there's a glass of water. I pick it up. Do you really mean to say that was determined by my karma? He says, yes. And then Ramana Maharshi says, but you always have the freedom to stand aside. The only freedom we have is to break our identification with the body-mind complex. At the level of the body-mind, everything is 100% determined by the law of karma. And Swami Vivekananda holds the same view. But as I said, there are other Hindu traditions which believe that the law of karma isn't fully determinative in that way. It's not a thoroughgoing determinism. What's an example? Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. The philosophy there, what you find is that Patanjali says in the sutra, karma determines three main parameters in our life. Jati, Ayu, Bhoga. Jati means which species we're born into, hopefully not a banana slug. Ayu, lifespan. And then Bhoga, the mix of pleasant and unpleasant, happy and unhappy experiences in this lifetime. So in a general way. That leaves a lot of room for free will as well. Okay? And so there's a difference, there are different views. Now, what was Sri Ramakrishna's view? I have a whole article on this called Hard Theological Determinism and the Illusion of Free Will. You can look at it, it's an academic article. What does he say? He says, actually, we have no free will at all. God alone is the doer. And then you might ask, well, where does karma fit in? God created the law of karma. Sri Ramakrishna says this in one place, in the gospel. God is the creator of this law of karma. He achieves his purposes through the law of karma, using us as his instruments, which means God alone is a doer at the end of the day. And he says the Jivan Mukta, somebody asked about Jivan Mukti, right? He says the Jivan Mukta is the one who knows that God alone is a doer. Of course, we haven't attained Jivan Mukti, so we don't know that. We think we're the doer. Ahamkar vimudhatma karta hamiti manyate, Bhagavad Gita. Deluded by egoism, I think I'm the doer. In reality, God alone is the doer. And then you might ask, well, doesn't that get us off the hook in terms of morals? I do something bad, I say God's a doer. What's the problem? It's not my fault, blame God for everything. Not so fast. Sri Ramakrishna says, because somebody asks him this in the gospel, his answer is, go ahead and try. You're going to fall flat on your face. Your conscience is going to prick you. If you do something bad, you can't. God has wisely implanted in each of us the illusion of free will in order to prevent sin from increasing. This is exactly what he says. What does that mean? If we, as ordinary ignorant people, knew that we have no free will, then we would do all sorts of stuff that would be really bad. There's already enough suffering in the world, as this gentleman pointed out. It'll be 1,000 times worse if we all knew we didn't have free will. So God has implanted in us the illusion of free will and that feeling of moral responsibility so long as we have not realized God. Which means even if theoretically, there's no free will. You know, there's a new book that came out just recently, a couple of years ago, by Robert Sapolsky. He's a Stanford professor, and he wrote a fat book called Determined, using scientific evidence to support the view that we have absolutely no free will. And he says in the book, very interesting, he says, even though almost my entire life I haven't believed in free will, the moment I stop thinking about these things, it certainly feels like I'm free. I can't live my life, like as if there's no free will. And this is exactly what Sri Ramakrishna said. That's because God has created this world and created us in that way. Even if theoretically we believe there's no free will, it doesn't percolate into our lives. That only happens when we realize God. And when we realize God, we realize that God is a doer, but at that point, Sri Ramakrishna says, one cannot make a false step. You can't, because you're now a perfect instrument of God. So long as you haven't realized God, you can't help but feel that you're free, and you also then have to take responsibility for your actions. You have to feel moral responsibility for your actions. Even if, at the end of the day, ultimately, there's no free will and God is a doer, you can't help but feel that you're free. And if you try to do all sorts of stuff that you wouldn't be proud of, your conscience is going to prick you, and it's going to affect your sleep, and you're not going to do very well. And so that's why it behooves you to engage in good actions and to try to make as much spiritual progress as possible. Yeah. Thank you.
Can I finish this 1 second?
That's up to you.
Two things first. Those who are interested in, he mentioned about Lance Nelson's article on Jivan Mukta and Moksha. You are welcome. You talk with me. I'll be happy to provide you. Second, we function on donation basis for this organization to do what we do. So help us the best we can, or you can, to promote him and others to come here, and so we can listen to them.
Yes, the wonderful work that the center is doing is done based on donations from the generosity of people like you. So please do donate to the center. They would greatly appreciate it, and that's the way that the work will continue here. Thank you.
And one more thing, the free will and theological determinism is an essay that he wrote. And if you are interested, you are welcome. I'll be happy to provide you.
There you go. And then the new one on Swami Vivekananda's views on free will be coming out soon. I think early 2026 in the volume on Arinam Chakraborty. I think it's called Thinking Without Borders. It'll be published by Bloomsbury. Thank you. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.
Swami, thank you so much for being with us for the last 2 days. It's just always such a blessing to have you here with us. And thank you so much for everyone who attended yesterday and today, and to all those who contribute to our food so that we can continue to offer